The United States was not just built by presidents and politicians, but by thousands of federal workers, clerks, diplomats, postmasters, customs officials, the names of whom history has mostly forgotten. These unelected men, and occasionally women, formed the backbone of the early republic, administering laws, collecting taxes, and expanding the reach of the federal government across a vast and growing nation. But who were they? Where did they come from? And what can their stories tell us about the government they helped to create? The Creating a Federal Government project shines a light on these overlooked figures, mapping their presence, tracking their movements, and revealing the scale of the federal workforce in the early United States. Its findings challenge some of our longest-held assumptions and could offer a new intervention into American politics in 2025. Tonight, we dive into the details with the project's creator, Peter Kastor. What did it mean to be a federal employee in the early United States? How did unelected officials shape the country's development? And what does this project tell us about the role of government then and now? This is Creating the Federal Government. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello everybody and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. And today, for the third time I think now, we are welcoming back Peter Kastor, this time to talk about something that he's specifically even more excited about than usual, because we are talking about creating a federal government. That is his project that he's created over the course of the last year on the subject of how the US was formed in a bureaucratic sense. So it talks about government not in terms of elected officials, but in terms of the civil service and everyone else, indeed, that the government employed early on. I dare say it's actually quite relevant to political happenings in the US today. Peter teaches history at the Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author, editor of 8 books on the era of the American Revolution, but of specific relevance, as I said today, is his Creating the Federal Government project, which we're obviously going to talk to, so I won't spoil the fun, but the link will be in the description if you want to play around with it first and then listen, or you can do that afterwards. Peter, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to be here.
Also alongside me today is not the voice of Zach White, who gets too excited when Peter's on, like an excitable chihuahua, and instead we've decided to bring in our very own American Luke Reynolds. How are you, Luke?
I'm very well. It's a pleasure to be here for something that is, honestly, I've taught American history for years in addition to my European history, and even I am still sort of sometimes confused and fascinated by the borders between federal and state government and what qualifies for what. So I'm looking forward to this talk enormously. And I will just add my own words to Josh's. I've played around with this website, especially the map, and it's a lot of fun. So you are going to want to go and take a look. I mean, even look, this is a podcast, right? So you can even have it open and play with it while we're talking about it.
What technology we have in the 21st century. Um, right, I'm going to allow you to fill in my blank, if you like, Peter, and say what the creating the federal government project is, and what is the rationale behind it.
So, Creating a Federal Government is a web-based digital history project that reconstructs the federal workforce from 1789 to 1829. It has the career records of approximately 38,000 men and women who were federal employees during that period. And as Luke was saying, it has a map that shows I think, 1,700 locations in land claimed by the US and around the world where federal employees were located. So it goes from St. Louis, where I am, to New York, where Luke is, but it goes all the way to Honolulu and Manila and Guangzhou. It goes around the world. And then the fun part for me also was writing a narrative text for this that would explain what the federal government was and what it is now, what it did then, and what it does now. So that's what the project does. The origin story for this project is actually from something that Americans hear all the time, which is we often hear the founding fathers invoked by people who are claiming the founders wanted a big government. No, the founders wanted a small government. And what struck me is we had no idea what the founders actually built, what kind of government they had. People tend to quote the Federalist Papers, which were, of course, written before the federal government started working, or they find one or two quotes from Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. My goal in this was to understand the federal government as a reality. Who was in it? What did they do? Where were they located? What were their lives like? And what kind of a job did they do?
I mean, it's a an onerous task in a way, and sort of those definitions, as you say, it's something that we all assume we know, and then when we actually think about it, there's that moment of, wait, how do we define this exactly?
Right.
It is that kind of thing. All right, so let's get into sort of a couple of these the quote unquote easy definitions to start off with. Um, so, what is a federal government or the federal government, and what is a federal employee?
Those are great questions. And I would say they're simple questions. They're not necessarily easy ones. Many people don't naturally know the answers to those. First, we need to understand what people refer to as the federal system, what they mean by it now. When I use that term, I use it as one that refers to the relationship between the central government, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and the individual state governments and what their relative roles and responsibilities are. And that's frankly the way people understood federalism 200 years ago, or the way they understood it in 1789 when the federal government came into being. So let's leave aside, that's federalism. When people discussed the federal government, when they discuss it now, they refer to this central government, this national government. And all those are terms people used. And a part of it is very familiar to Americans. They learn about it in their civics courses, in their U.S. history courses. When I was a kid, there was a TV show that many people still see called Schoolhouse Rock, and they had a segment called Three Ring Circus, which very effectively explained that the federal government contained the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches. The executive branch being the president, the legislative branch being the Congress, and the judicial branch being the courts. All correct. But in addition to those, of course, there were a lot of people who were not only paid by the federal government, but most importantly, took their marching orders from the federal government. And the number of those appointed officials far exceeded the number of elected officials it's the case now, and it was the case then. So when I talk about the federal government, that's what I'm talking about. For my project, my goal for federal employees were that this needed to be somebody who was either paid by the central government or was appointed in an unpaid role, and I'll tell you what some of those are in a moment, by the federal government, crucially, somebody who was appointed. The only elected officials I've got in my data set are the presidents, but I don't have members of Congress. I don't have the congressional staff. Members of Congress are only in there if they also served in some kind of federally appointed role. So Andrew Jackson is in there. It's because he was the governor of territorial Florida and president of the United States, but he was, of course, also a representative from Tennessee.
I have a rabbit hole, Peter. I've just come up with one on the fly. I feel like Zach White has entered my brain and contaminated it. So what you were just saying, it reminded me of, I guess, the French Revolution. And I'm not going to ask you a question about the French Revolution, but in the French Revolution, one of the things that happened with regards to bureaucracy and unelected positions is they tried to make as many positions in government, whether that be local, national, regional, elected as possible. Was kind of was there any sense, I guess, in the American Revolution that um of forming a government that was kind of as elected as possible. I mean, at the time, was there any sort of resentment about the fact that like this wasn't a full democracy because there were still going to be unelected positions, unlike the case in the French Revolution when they just kind of opened the floodgates and said we're going to vote for literally everyone?
So I'll say that to a certain degree, the French were taking their model from the Americans. And during the American Revolution, that's exactly what Americans argued about. And it varied from state to state. After the British colonies, and I always emphasize this, the British mainland colonies south of Canada declared their independence and became independent states. Each one of them wrote a constitution. And some states, like Pennsylvania, established a large number of elected offices that had very low property requirements. It was much easier for people to vote in Pennsylvania. It was much easier for people to hold office in Pennsylvania than it was in Rhode Island or Connecticut. Nonetheless, all of these states opened up large numbers of offices to election, but there were also certain offices that they always believed should be the subject of appointment. And the same held true after ratification of the Constitution. And in fact, people believed that one of the great virtues of the Constitution, by providing for the people to be represented through the elected members of the House of Representatives, by providing for states to be represented in the Senate, because at that time, senators were selected by state legislatures, and then by there being a president, they concluded that appointed officials would have checks that would prevent them from becoming a source of tyranny. So usually when people got upset with the government, they would say it's a bunch of unelected people who are appointed to tell us what to do. But I'm struck by how quickly Americans accommodated themselves to appointed offices. Now, there's one exception that I think is an important one, and it's very relevant to life here in Missouri. In addition to the states, the United States, the federal government laid claim to a vast area of land that was organized as federal territories. Missouri was a federal territory from 1805 until 1821. And during that period, it was governed from Washington, D.C. All of the officials, from governor to coroner, were appointed by the federal leadership. And in these federal territories, residents quickly became upset that they couldn't elect the kinds of offices that people could elect in states. And they would always mobilize to become states, partly so they could be more directly involved in selecting their leaders. The other part of this that I think is also important is once Congress met for the first time in 1789 and George Washington became the first president, the question was, who would actually run the appointed offices? Who would be in charge of the army? Who would be in charge of the diplomats? And they considered lots of options. One was, oh, it'll be a committee of Congress and the president. No, it'll be a separate entity altogether. And eventually they concluded all of those were just completely impractical, and that federal employees should report in a system that eventually ended with the president of the United States.
I'm struck, especially when talking about sort of federal land and the 37 states, I guess you can argue that became that started as federal land. And this sort of, yes, it was all run from DC. It was all run from via postal services at the time and that kind of thing. But it's important to remember, I think, and this is still the truth, that in all likelihood, the majority of the federal employees that you interact with on a daily basis, then and now, are from your area. They're relatively local because this country is so vast that it is in a fairness, the federal government is local as well as national. So I'm curious, sort of this is the social historian in me coming out and the cultural historian in me coming out. Sort of what does this project show us and tell us about the kinds of people who worked as federal employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to talk about them. And I think you really hit the nail on the head, which is a lot of them are local officials. In fact, often they would be selected specifically because they'd held local office. And the assumption was, oh, if this person's a leader in his community at the municipal or state level, he can be a federal official. But it kind of depends on the office that the person had. And frankly, whether they were willing to move. In in Washington's first term, he selected a lot of people who got an appointment, didn't even know they'd been chosen, and declined because they didn't want to move. So let's talk about these offices a bit. I like the way you put it as a social and cultural historian. One thing I think that's, first of all, really important to recapture how different it is from now is that nowadays there is a provision that certain senior level officials have to have their names submitted for the advice and consent of the Senate, cabinet, the folks right below the cabinet, the leadership in the military. At this time, almost every official has their name submitted for advice and consent. The Secretary of State has his name submitted. Every second lieutenant in the Army, every midshipman in the Navy, everybody except clerks, postmasters, and enlisted personnel. Everyone else, their names are submitted for advice and consent. So the first offices that the Washington administration selected were revenue collectors, and they were located in the ports along the eastern seaboard, and almost all of them had started their careers as merchants in those ports. So these are kind of middling officials, and I looked at them. It's the social historian in me. So their median age was around 40 years old. A lot of them, in fact, had failing business interests, and they said, I need a job. Others were chosen specifically because they were older. So these aren't, some of them are young men on the make, but a lot of them aren't. They're these guys in middle age. That's the case for these people. I want to go to the other side of the world. I mentioned there are some offices that weren't even paid. The most common of those were consuls, and these are commercial representatives overseas, and the government just didn't have the money to pay them. You had people who volunteered to do it because many of them were merchants in Genoa or in Cork in Ireland, and they thought that doubling as a federal official would get them a job. It would help them. It would improve their reputation locally. And the single most common job in my data set are postmasters. You mentioned them. So the postmasters were everywhere. There are about 12,000 post offices created during this time. I don't know exactly where they were because many of them were in towns that no longer exist, or they're in places called Jones's Store or Smith's Ferry. And that's a great way to understand what it was to be a postmaster. You'd have a general store, the mail would also arrive there, and you not only got paid to be a postmaster, but you thought, oh, someone's going to come in to get their mail, and they'll also buy some flour or some nails. And so, again, you get a lot of these people for whom the federal government won't pay the bills for them, but they make some extra revenue and they think it's going to help their day job.
It's funny, this is almost more British than American because you go into the local towns of Britain these days and the post office is a corner of the general or of a general store of a quick
Exactly.
quick mart. On the subject of who's being appointed and sort of merchants and all of this, I just want to give you a moment to talk about sort of what is always associated with me is one of the magic words of the early republic, which is disinterested, disinterest. And can you talk us through a little bit about that?
So I agree with you. That's the great phrase to understand it and to understand what Americans hoped their leaders would be. And they started thinking about that in terms of their elected officials. Disinterested meant not that you were uninterested. In fact, they wanted elected officials to be passionately interested, but that they would not have a personal interest, meaning a personal financial interest in any policy, and also that they themselves could operate with a certain distance from local interest. so that they might need to make a necessary decision that benefited the country but not their region, that benefited their region but not their town. I would say for these appointed officials, the even at the start, the concern was that they be nonpartisan. They Disinterestedness is a term that was used very much to refer to elected officials. The idea was that would make them virtuous. But especially as the party system came into being in the late 1790s, Americans were already talking about the fact that federal employees needed to be nonpartisan. And the problem is that whenever parties changed hands, the party that came in would fear that that was the case, that the party that the government was filled with all these partisans. And the first president to try to do that was Thomas Jefferson. And when he came into office when he moved into the White House in 1801, there were several people living in the White House, the majority of them enslaved. He brought slaves with him who served him. But there was only one other free person living there. It was his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, of Lewis and Clark expedition fame. And the first job that Jefferson gave to Lewis, he said, I've got a list of all the officers in the Army. Tell me who's a Federalist. Tell me who's a Republican. Jefferson was, at first, he was obsessed with this. And his Secretary of the Treasury said, oh, yeah, we got to find all the Federalists. But it was his Secretary of State who said that's just going to create division. Well, his Secretary of the State was James Madison. He'd written the Constitution. He knew that this was not the right way to do things. And so Jefferson actually is the president who created West Point because he believed we should have an officer corps that is nonpartisan. And this is the way that we can not only train them in their necessary technical skills, but we can train them to be Americans first and partisans second.
I don't know if either of you have watched Yes Minister, but the the premise of Yes Minister, if the listeners haven't, is basically that the minister thinks he's in charge, but in reality it's the humble functionary, quote unquote, Humphrey in the background. Obviously we're not just talking about kind of the Humphrey Applebys of the world, we're also talking about the postmasters when we talk about federal employees. But how important do you think unelected officials actually were in the early United States? I imagine you think they're pretty important, so I'll add a kind of a second part onto that. And it's, do you think can you identify any differences or similarities between kind of the early in federal employees, if you like, on the payroll of the government versus like for the rest of history up to today?
That's a big question.
They're
And
two
it's actually a
huge
great
questions.
question. Yeah, it's a huge question, but actually, there is a way in which, and I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. But one thing I would say is that both the structure of the appointed officialdom and the tasks that are assigned to it are the manifestations of the most important priorities for the elected officials. So I think we can understand that by looking at the first agencies that were established by the United States. And they were established in this, it's not so much they're established in this order, but the guys who ran them were selected in this order. Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, Postmaster General. And it's not just that I believe this, but federal leaders and American citizens believed this. They believed that the future of the republic, and they thought in those terms, they thought the republic was fragile, it could come apart at any moment. They said, our republic will not survive if we don't have good diplomatic relations overseas. We need a State Department to do that. They said, our government will not survive unless we can get our fiscal house in order. We need a Treasury Department to do that. And the eventual prosperity of the United States hinged not just on the Alexander Hamiltons and Albert Gallatins who served as Secretary of the Treasury, but on all of these customs collectors located throughout the country. American leaders believed they felt surrounded by enemies on all sides. They thought the Atlantic was a dangerous place. They worried about the border with Canada. They worried about their native neighbors in the West. And they said, we need an army to protect us from that. And a few years later, they created a navy as well. And the final point, I always think the post office is the clearest indication of it. They recognized that this union was in some ways a fiction. It was a fiction that people needed to believe in. And one of the amazing things the post office did was to show to Americans that they were all Americans. So if you lived, there's a big migration pattern that goes from the upper South to the lower South and from Pennsylvania, New York to the Midwest. So if you lived in Ohio or Indiana and you could write to your friends and relatives back in New York and Pennsylvania, and they got that mail quickly, that showed that the Union existed. If you lived in Mississippi or Alabama and you could write to a business partner in Virginia or Maryland, that also proved the Union existed. So there are all of these ways that this operates. And I think that's still the case now. And of course, that's the fight that's going on in the United States right now. The arguments that Americans are having about which agencies to keep and support, which agencies to slash and remove, are partly arguments about the cost, but they are also arguments about what government should be doing. I realize I've been emphasizing the ways that early federal leaders saw an essential role for their government and for all of these appointed officials. I mean, it was costly, but there are times when it was divisive. Americans argued about the cost of this government. They argued about what it should do. Then as now. That's the other thing that's unchanged. People argue about what their government should do.
You've led directly on to kind of the next question, the big one, if you like, the one that people have tuned in for, probably by virtue of the clickbaity title I've given it when I choose it. So today, the question of the kind of the scope and size of the American government is one of the big talking points in political debate, especially since Trump's become president in 2024. Um, Often advocates of a smaller government, as you say, will point to the early US and the beliefs of the founding fathers to say that the US was intended to have a government with as little bureaucracy and as few institutions as possible, and in fairness, vice versa. Um, I'm interested in kind of what, if anything, this project contributes to that debate. I mean, does it tell us anything about how big or small the US government? Well, it tells us how big it was, but does it say how big it kind of should be?
Right. That's a question I've gone back and forth. I've gone back and forth about a lot, and I've been in a lot of conversations with people. And my one way to approach these that historians often do is they say, look, here's this precedent, and it's going to support this one outlook. My starting point is that the government that the founding fathers created was larger, more capacious, more ambitious than many American conservatives now would believe. At the same time, it was smaller and more limited than many liberals would now wish, in that there were things that the founders couldn't even imagine their government doing and would have rejected that we now feel differently about. So that's my starting point, which is we need to see it on its own terms, and we need to see it with our own humility, that before we start invoking the founders, we need to understand it a little differently. But to that, I would say the way I always start talking about this, and I may have said this already today, is that when most people now try to talk about the government, they they quote the Federalist Papers, they find two letters from Thomas Jefferson, and I think that doesn't even scratch the surface of what actually happened in the government. My starting point, the most striking thing to me, is the way the founding fathers assumed the reins of government and they started building. They started building and they started growing. When George Washington came into office, the first thing he concluded was the federal government needed to employ people, because if it didn't, the federal experiment and the American experiment would collapse. Now, by 1792, Congress was already demanding an accounting. They said, we need to see a list of everyone who you've hired because we want to know what we've paid for. That's also part of the big story. Americans were able to be comfortable with this because Congress was meeting its watchdog requirements in keeping an eye on this. Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned, came into office convinced that there was all this fat in the federal government, that he could cut it down to size. And in his first year, he did fire a bunch of people, but he didn't eliminate those offices. He hired new people for them. And in fact, as far as I can tell, and I'll admit, it can be kind of hard to track year by year, the number of federal employees, certainly the number of civil employees, was higher when Jefferson left office than when he arrived. So why did it grow? It grew because the United States faced profound challenges, and Jefferson concluded that the only solution to those were to increase federal capacity. So I really want to emphasize that point, that I think we need to understand that time with a little humility. We can't just sort of invoke it to give a clear approval for what we currently believe in these current political debates. But one thing I do come out of this thinking is that there's often a time when we see certain founding fathers as these kind of anti-government reductionists, when I see them as people who actually often increased the number of employees and the scope of what the federal government could do.
I'm once again reminded of Yes Minister, and when he demands to figure out where they can cut expenditure, and to do that, they have to hire 300 more people to look through the expenditure to figure out where to cut it. Um, all right, a slightly less loaded question for you, but I think one that fits really nicely into this.
Good, less loaded is welcome.
I thought it might be. Um, you talked a lot about sort of these merchants being employed almost immediately and things like that, and the order in which this is done. So, how much of this is a direct response slash almost a panic response to the catastrophe of the Articles of Confederation? Or not even, maybe, look, that's an unfair assumption. Maybe there's a world in which the Articles of Confederation worked perfectly, but how they collapsed in the early republic.
Yeah, that's a great question. If there's a world where the articles work, I don't know where that world is. So I think it is fair to say if we're not going to call it a catastrophe, we'll call it a failed experiment. And it failed in exactly the areas that were the focus of the early federal regime, which is it failed on fiscal, diplomatic, and military and legal uh, grounds. It failed in all those areas. So a lot of it was a reaction to that. It was partly, as you said, this kind of panic response to all the problems, but it also gave the solutions a focus. They said, these are the areas where it didn't work. And so these are the first things we're going to do. And that continued to guide them. And also, whenever people raised questions about the federal system, and people they would say it's putting too much power in the hands of a central government, and that government now has all these employees, and those employees can restrict our freedom. The response would be, so you want to go back to the articles? I don't think that's what you want. And what's helpful is there was a second experiment with the articles, and it's called the Confederacy. The structure for the Confederate States of America was very much along the model of the Articles of Confederation, and it was a failure in exactly the same ways and for exactly the same reasons that the Articles were.
I think that's a really, really good way to put it, and I think that's almost the important thing and the reason that the United States and the federal government emerges the way it does is because they look at the articles as a failed experiment. They look, okay, what did we do wrong? What do we fix? And in some cases, what do we keep? Right? The federal state structure is relatively similar under both,
Uh-huh.
but it is this sort of failed experiment that leads to something that works in the lab.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite examples of this, we'll get to your question, Luke, about who these guys were. And I really like this one. So under the articles, the states gathered most of the revenue. After the Constitution, they continued to raise revenue. They had direct taxes, they were administered at the county level, and people were taxed on their personal property, their landed property, and their human property. But the other thing states had done is some of them levied import duties. They had customs collectors. And it was pretty clear to those guys that those jobs were going to go federal because federal leaders thought, yeah, this is a way to make money. And so there's a mad scramble by these guys to keep their jobs. And one example of this is in June 1789, George Washington's just been inaugurated. The federal government set up in New York. Customs collectors are coming to New York to meet with him personally. One of them doesn't. It's a guy in Massachusetts. And he writes a letter to Washington that's a very typical job application letter. He said, I fought in the Revolution. I have a large family that I need to provide for, but I've served my country. And I've shown, gets to your point, that I'm disinterested, that I love the Constitution. Please don't fire me. And so Washington keeps him. He's a guy named Thomas Melville. He holds a number of commercial offices in the Boston area. He serves for the federal government from 1789 until 1830. Andrew Jackson eventually removes him, but I think it's partly because the guy's 80 years old. And and he has to be reappointed periodically. He's reappointed every time. One of the things he learned from this is that this can give you a sense of value, a sense of status, and a steady job. And so Thomas Melville must have told this to his children and his grandchildren. I'll bet he told his grandson, Herman Melville. So when Herman Melville wanted to be a novelist, when he's writing Moby Dick, his day job was in the customs house in New York. And that was this crucial experience for him. So I find Thomas Melville's got a great story, but he also he's one of the guys who connects the articles to the federal system, shows the continuity in what they did.
That's a wonderful anecdote, and I should also say, if people want to learn more about the Articles of Confederation and Confederation in America, we have a dedicated episode to that, so you can cue that up.
Fantastic.
Um, I want to humor you, Peter, and talk some more about postmasters. You've already told us about kind of the significance, I guess, of having a postmaster at the local level nearby, showing you that kind of you know, this the federal government is closer than it would otherwise be to ordinary Americans. Um, but when you load up the project and you scroll on the map, one of the options you can select is kind of the postmaster heat map, which will show you kind of the density of different postmasters in different states and territories across the US. What 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 is the distribution of postmasters, I suppose, is the first question. And kind of what does that show us in terms of how the US is like organized geographically, I guess?
Right, right. So I'll begin by saying it's an interesting technology story. As I mentioned, unlike most of these other officials, I couldn't locate them because they're in all these places that don't exist anymore. In the update of the site that I'm going to be doing later this year, we'll have them at the county level. We're going to have a county level heat map. And that's been a technological challenge, but a lot of fun. So the one word I would use to answer really your question is increase, both over time and over space. So in any given year, there were, of course, more postmasters in and around the major population centers of the United States than anywhere else. So that shouldn't surprise anybody that there were more in the Philadelphia, New York, and Boston area than there were in Western Missouri, for example. It also probably doesn't surprise people that the total number of postmasters increased every single year. And it's the most striking increase that you see over time. It is, in fact, other than when the US mobilized for war in 1812, it's the area of the government that increased the most over this time. There also were more postmasters in the eastern states than in the western states. A lot of it really did reflect the national population. but it was actually out of alignment with that population in one way. Postmasters are a great way to understand American democracy and actually how it differed from Western Europe during the era of the Napoleonic Wars. If you lived in London, if you lived in Paris, you got your mail delivered you could get it delivered several times a day. It was incredible. If you lived in a major city in Western Europe, you could do that. But if you lived in a small town in metropolitan France, you didn't get your mail as often. And if you lived in certainly somewhere in the French Empire or the British Empire, you'd have a long wait. And in many of those empires, the post office was part of the Ministry of Finance because it made money. You paid a lot to send your mail. Well, in the United States, average American citizens believed that postal delivery was essential. And they told their representatives, and their representatives took that with them to Congress. And so you would get the example I would often think of is I've charted out the growth in the number of post offices in Missouri over a 30-year period. It's pretty staggering how quickly it went up, and I can imagine how this happened. Missouri had one representative in Congress, but he would go into the House chamber and he could go to the representative from New York and say, your vote means no more than my vote. And you want the appropriation for the Erie Canal and how that's going to connect Pennsylvania, New York, connect you to that. You need to vote more money for the postmasters so that I can have mail delivery in my district so that my constituents can get their mail. In the United States, the postal system was a revenue drain, cost a ton of money. But the federal leadership knew that and they supported it because there was a lot of political pressure to do this and because they knew it made the union seem real. So that's a big point I would emphasize. The other point, though, is assembling the list of all these postmasters was an interesting puzzle. And it speaks a lot about how disorganized and unbureaucratic this place was because bureaucracy is really a term that's created in the late 19th century. And it's the idea of that you can have organization, clearly defined hierarchies, and really good record keeping. Well, in 1792, when Congress wanted a list of all federal employees, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton did this for the State Department, the Treasury Department. And they went to the postmaster and he came up with a list of one himself, Postmaster General, because he just didn't have a list of all his employees. The only way you could really reconstruct the names of all these postmasters is from these books that were kept in the post office, where every time they appointed somebody, they would record it there. But that didn't mean there was a book of all the people in St. Louis. It simply meant here's everybody. So you get one guy for St. Louis. He's appointed in 1804. 5 pages later, you get another guy for St. Louis in 1808. And it was, in some ways, it was a well-run government, but it was, the way it was organized would be pretty staggering. You know, I mentioned all these Senate nominations, and we know about them because they're in the Senate records. Many of them are written in the president's hand. Years ago, I was in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I saw a listing that said nominations, Jefferson administration. I said, well, that looks interesting. And they brought an ammo box. I'm not kidding, like the kind of box that would hold 50 caliber ammunition. That's where this stuff was stored. And it was a pile of sheets of paper in the very recognizable handwriting of Thomas Jefferson. And it would say things like, I nominate Albert Gallatin to be Secretary of the Treasury. I nominate John Q. Public to be revenue collector in Charleston, South Carolina. It's just all on the same sheet. And he'd be handwriting these every week. Eventually, it's handed over to clerks, but it was a government that was there were central offices in Washington, D.C., but they're very small. It's administratively decentralized. The workload was not only staggering, but I think really inefficient. This is not what the president should be doing. There are other things he has to do. And there are times when I marvel that this government was actually able to operate given how it was organized.
You know, Josh has repeatedly sort of commented on this podcast about my sort of knowledge of the British state and the British everyday life. But if I'm allowed a moment of pure patriotism for a second, I this is really reminding me that there are a couple of things that the United States fundamentally formalized before almost any other country on Earth. And I'm reminded, sort of, that postal service, right? Britain gets the penny post in 1840, some 50 years later. It's in our Constitution that we are that what's going on in Congress and the Senate is to be recorded and publicly available. And yes, you can find newspaper records of debates in Parliament, but it's not official and it's not everything in there until the mid 19th century. There is this sort of, in certain ways, we really were the cutting edge. And it is worth remembering that. And I think yeah, this post office thing, and I having been in that situation of I used to joke that as a historian I had two settings. Where on earth is my data, and why do I have so much data? And there's nothing in between. And it's sort of that very reminds me, but I love that ammo can story, especially since it actually makes a fundamental amount of sense. They're designed to be waterproof. They're designed to go through hell. They're designed to preserve what's inside. It makes a deal of sense.
Yeah. I love the way you talk about your data because that's kind of how these offices operated. I was only able to do this project because of the meticulous record preservation. Even if it wasn't always organized, our knowledge is only as good as the records to which we have access. And, it's pretty remarkable that all of this stuff is there. And it's in many ways a tribute to the National Archives. That's where a lot of the material for this collection comes from in one way or another, either the National Archives or the Library of Congress.
Absolutely. So I want to take us from one extreme of this map to the other, right? We've done the postmasters and the heat map, and I'm actually genuinely looking forward to seeing that on a county level because I think that's going to be it's just going to be intriguing, and so many PhD students are going to have their lives made so much easier by what you're doing. Um, but at the other end of the scale, you open this map and you assume clicking in this, oh, this is going to be a map of the continental United States. But you've got the world there. And as you mentioned, there are federal employees across the globe. A lot of them are, almost none of them are being sent by the federal government. They're all there already. Um, and I'm just, I'm curious what this project shows us about international diplomacy in the period. And you've touched on this a little bit. This is a chance for you to sort of expand a little bit more. And also the role of the ordinary official in it. Because, foreign relations especially is one of those areas where we concentrate so much on the very, very top. But those top meetings only happen after conversation after conversation after conversation below them. So, yeah, I just wanted to sort of give you an opportunity to talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we have a tendency. First of all, I want to say I don't want to romanticize federal employees during this time. These characters, they're characters. Um, but we do tend to romanticize diplomats. And how could you not during this period? I mean, the the earliest diplomats from the US are like Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And then John Quincy Adams has a whole career. But, they come and go. And these commercial consuls are there all the time. And I ask people now, do you know what a consular office does? And they usually do know. It's like that's where you go if you lose your passport. That's where you go if you get in some legal trouble. And there was an element of that a long time ago. They actually were the first intelligence operatives. They gathered local newspapers. They asked a lot of questions. They would send these long dispatches. And this was all that the leadership in Washington, D.C. had to go on. Incredibly important information. Meanwhile, when American merchant ships showed up, if the ship showed up and the sailors left and they got drunk and wound up in jail, the consul had to get them out. The thing that strikes me is that, week in and week out, year in and year out, they are it. That's where I agree with you. I mean, I keep thinking about the consul in Canton, China. It's now Guangzhou, but that's one of the first consulates. And the time between when you sent a message and got a reply was about a year. And these guys they're just on their own. So like you, I found them fascinating. There's one other part of the map that I want to emphasize. I wanted a global map. I also did not want the boundaries of the United States on it because there is no good boundary data set. That when we see maps, you've probably taught with maps like these, they're good. They're good in a lot of ways, but what they tend to show is how the federal leadership understood their territorial claims. So one of the things that was very important to me was to think through how I would map out federal officials who are in the North American West. And when do I list them as being on US territory? And when do I list them in being on non-US territory? And I want to be very clear, I'm not talking about the kind of long-standing sovereignty claims of Native Americans. My point on this is that all of those officials are on native land. But there are points in history, there are moments when Native Americans cease to be the governing authority. So again, using Missouri as a case in point. If it's 1810, the area of St. Louis was an area that the US clearly governed. The Osage who lived near here, they had ceded that claim. And often it's a coercive cession, but they had ceded it. So I color that as US. But then when I've got an Indian agent in the upper Missouri and he's negotiating with the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara, that's land that the US claimed through the Louisiana Purchase, but the US didn't govern there. No, that Indian agent is a visitor. He's a guest. And if he doesn't behave, he's going to learn. He's going to learn it the hard way. So that was really important to me to list those spaces. Also, spaces that seem very familiar. Santa Fe. That's land that was claimed and governed by Spain and later by Mexico. New Orleans flips. So it starts the map as non-US territory for Spanish and then very briefly French. And then the color changes when they cede it to the United States. And it was really tough to do all that. It was a lot of fun. And I had a terrific GIS coder, a guy named Brian Haberberger, who did all the hard work to make that actually work.
At the very start of that answer, Peter, you said something I want to follow up on, if that's all right. You said, I don't want to romanticize these federal employees. Some of them are characters. And you can't say that kind of comment without spilling the beans a little bit of what you mean by that. I mean, what kind of characters are we talking about in terms of these federal employees? Do you have perhaps any anecdotes?
Right. So I got more anecdotes than you have time for. So some of them have long careers and they become very important officials. And the example, so I want to give one or two examples, like one or two guys at the top of the rung, top rungs of the ladder, and then some guys under it. So one of them is the two first I want to mention is, of course, John Quincy Adams. Later becomes president of the United States. His father was president. He had never held an elected office before he became president. He'd been a senator, Massachusetts. Their legislature had selected him. They then removed him because they didn't like the way he voted. But for almost 30 years, he was a diplomat. And he served in all of these countries. He was in Berlin, he was in St. Petersburg, he was in London. He later served as Secretary of State, and he learned how to be an American through this. He's one example and a celebrated one. Then there's William Henry Harrison. And most Americans, if they've ever heard of him, know that he was the first president to die in office. He was elected in 1841, gave the longest inaugural in US history, and got what he paid for. He caught pneumonia and died 30 days later. But he served, and so he's kind of a joke, but he served as a very important territorial official. He was a senior general in the War of 1812, and he basically wouldn't take orders from Washington, D.C. He said, I'm in charge out here. I'm going to make these decisions and I'm going to make things work on my own. So you get those very high level officials. But then you get people like the collector in New York, who remain nameless, partly because I can't remember his name. But in 1803, he basically absconds um, with the revenue that's been collected. He just sort of disappears and takes with him a whole bunch of the money that had been raised through import duties. So then they got to send people out to find him. But the other thing is that at this time, the question is who's going to be responsible for these? And the US attorney at the time is kind of personally responsible for this stuff. And the US attorney at that time was a guy named Edward Livingston. He was from one of the wealthiest families in New York City. He was also the mayor of New York at the same time. And this scandal just brings him down. Thomas Jefferson fires him as U.S. attorney. He's removed as the mayor of New York. There's a whole scandal, and he has to leave. This is the city that his family has kind of ruled. And he has to flee. He goes to New Orleans, kind of rebuilds his political career there. And, people think he's a complete pariah. He later gets elected office. He becomes a senator and later becomes Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State. So there are these guys just floating around, and they do some pretty weird stuff. Then there are all of these people, and I always emphasize this, men and women, who just kind of do their jobs anonymously and seem to do it with relative anonymity and relative effectiveness, and sort of figuring them out really, really has been the most intriguing part of the story for me.
We're gonna ask a technical question, not least because when off air, I think you've mentioned that you want to kind of do justice to I think the pretty large team that you've had behind you working on
Right.
this, not just historical, also kind of technological, I suppose. This project is huge, as you've said, it contains over 30,000 entries. So where does that data come from, and what was the process in terms of digitizing it and getting it to the website and making it look as snazzy as it does?
Right. So the process is time consuming and expensive. And I have the time. I'm fortunate. I'm a faculty member. I'm a professor. I get to invest myself in research projects. And that's that along with teaching are the two great joys of my professional life. Uh, and then in terms of how I did this, the two collections I started with, I think really show how this came into being. Some data sources already exist. The Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C. created an extraordinary biographical database of federal judges. It has not just their names and their offices, but when they were born, where they went to law school, when they died, and where they served. So all of that is in there with all of their rich data. But then I knew there were all of these other people who had been nominated and there was no record of them. The Library of Congress had digitized, by which I mean they had scanned the Senate Executive Journal, which recorded the day-to-day proceedings of the Senate. But that meant I hired a bunch of really, really wonderful undergraduates to work with me and go through that document. And their job was to find every reference to a nomination. They found over 5,000 of them between 1789 and 1829. I have tried to get AI to do that now, and it cannot do it reliably. So we think, oh, a computer can look at a scanned image and convert it into text. It doesn't do it reliably from this time. Or a computer can read this text and understand it, but it can't. The names are spelled differently, the offices are described differently. It's very idiosyncratic. So it was this combination of taking a few, very few existing data collections And then a lot of collections that either needed to be digitized or were partially digitized and converting them into what we call machine readable form, a way a computer could understand and show. And that was the work of a whole bunch of undergraduates and graduate students. They did phenomenal work. That's just the data. How did this become a website? I don't have I don't have uh, a design-minded bone in my body. I don't know how to do stuff like that. So I was very fortunate in that when I was converting the data into a website, I needed someone to help me come up with a proof of concept visualization and a proof of concept on the GIS part, the map part. So I got the names of two students who had just graduated from my university. One was in our art and architecture school, which also does design, and she had specialized in digital design. And I said to her, here's what I want this to be able to do. Help me come up with a visual look that will be engaging and clear. So we worked on that. Then our engineering school gave me the name of somebody. They said, we've got a terrific student. She's a terrific coder, and she's really good with doing GIS, geographic information systems. So I hired both of them. And it's only when I tell them the name of the other that they said, yeah, we're roommates. So through the strangest coincidence, I hired two roommates and they did this phenomenal work. They had just graduated, they went on with their professional lives. But then I got another GIS coder to build out the map. I got uh, another team to help with the design. And then the crucial shout out that I have to give is within my university. We have a humanities digital workshop, and the professional staff there are the ones who guided me throughout this. Let's make sure this data is going to work. And then we have a web team that took the design and then mounted it on the web. And they maintain it and they fix it when it breaks. So I don't have to do that. And so that team has been crucial. I'm a humanities faculty member. We don't play well with others usually. And so the best part of this project was really learning how to collaborate on a team.
This is becoming a book, right, Peter? Am I right in
It
thinking that?
is. So I'm writing a book called How the Founders Governed: Danger and Decision in a Revolutionary Time. That's my working title. And that's actually also how this started. I wanted to write a book that would be the top-down story of how the founding fathers ran these agencies they created, these government bureaus they created. And then I realized I didn't know what these bureaus were. I didn't know who was in them. I didn't know how big they were or how small they were. And so I said, I can't write this book till I've got this data. And then the data, that really became my passion. So the website is finished, but the book is underway. And there are times when I think, wow, I wish I published that book now as Americans are debating this. And then there are times when I think, I'm really glad I didn't finish this book now, because as I've said, I want to tell this story on its own terms. I'm not writing this to advocate one political side or another in this very contested political moment. I said, let this site stand on its own. And it has a lot of text in it that's kind of the early version of the book that really frames out how the founding fathers went about building their government, what they thought it should do, and what they thought it shouldn't do.
It's quite the prerequisite to writing your book, going in having to create a your own resource with 38,000 entries. Peter, thank you so much for once again being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight to talk with you again, Josh. It's been terrific to meet you, Luke, as well. So thank you for having me.
Been a genuine pleasure. Thank you so much for this. It's been utterly Look, there's a running joke on this podcast that my go-to is utterly fascinating, but this has been, especially coming from this side of the pond where I interact with the federal government and the news to these days. This has been really, really interesting and quite eye-opening.
Peter Castor is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. If you haven't already, what the hell are you doing? Just go check out the Creating the Federal Government project. It's in the description. And also keep your eyes peeled for his new book on the subject. No, no date for that one, but I'm sure we'll let you know. Fantastic. That is all from us at the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon.
What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Flewick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.